Hello everyone, welcome to the What, Why, When podcast from Oxford University. My name is Dr. Matt Williams. I'm a tutor in politics here at Jesus College and I'm what's known as the Access Fellow here. I've got two fantastic guests with me who we will introduce in alphabetical order if that's all right. So starting with you, Charlie.
Hi everyone, I'm Charlie. I'm a third year history student here at Jesus College.
And Charlie, it should be noted, has his own podcast series. Do you mind just telling us quickly about that?
Yeah, it's called Oxpods, where we interview Oxford professors on their research interests. So it's a bit more dynamic and subject specific. So if you're looking for things like history, English, biology, human sciences, things like that, there might be something that interests you over there.
Yeah, check it out. And we've also got the amazing Imaan. Say hello, Imaan.
Yeah, sure. I'm Imaan. I'm the Digital Access Officer here at Jesus College.
Brilliant, and is the technical whiz behind putting this all together. So yeah, eternally grateful to Imaan. So today's big question, because that's what we do on this podcast, is we try and ask and answer big questions in half an hour, is power and why some humans seem to strive for it, thirst for it, whichever metaphorical verb you fancy. And we'll start with that classic thought experiment. What would you do if you were Prime Minister for a day, right? Just to sort of see what you're up for using your power for. So Imaan, just to get you warmed up, what sort of things might be top of your agenda if you were Prime Minister for a day?
That's really tricky.
Put you on the spot.
I think first port of call would be identify all of the major issues happening at the moment, whatever those are. I don't feel like I can name them all at the moment.
No, that's fine. I'm not testing that.
But identify which ones are most urgent and important.
Yeah.
And create a plan to try and address those, but also don't leave the long-term like non-urgent things too long because they also need addressing.
That sounds very wholesome. So you're going to sort of see what the world needs rather than what you need. You're not personalising
obviously.
it. Yeah, right. Good. Good. I mean, Charlie, as a historian, do you happen to know what prime ministers do typically do in their first few days of power? You know, when they're transitioning from relative powerlessness often to extreme power. Do you know what sort of steps are taken?
Well, I presume I guess a lot of this comes in like the planning period beforehand, especially if, say like the American presidential system, for instance, obviously they know for quite a while that they're going to be the president, so they can make arrangements ahead of time. But, obviously things like making appointments can have a huge impact on, how a term in government might go.
Right. So pointing to the cabinet specifically.
Yes.
Yeah.
I suppose allocating finances depend on the policies that perhaps the government ran with when they were being elected, things like that. And I also imagine that there's lots of unexpected things that probably come up in those first few days in government as well, because obviously you can't plan for everything.
No.
And you might have to make decisions that don't necessarily align with your values completely. Sure. I was often I actually won in my year 11 prom, which actually happened in year 12 because of COVID. I won most likely to be Prime Minister, but I never consider a thing like that just because I don't want to have to compromise my morals in that way. And I imagine, especially in those unexpected moments where you just have to kind of make a decision, you can't always completely follow the things that you absolutely believe in, especially if those things might not be politically expedient at the time.
Right, yeah, interesting. I mean, so I suppose it may be relatively surprising to learn, but actually prime ministers have to do a fair amount of just classic HR admin. For example, they have to pay rent on the 11 Downing Street flat. They have to pay their utility bills. They have to pay council tax on checkers. So there's quite a lot of just random admin. Presumably that gets sorted by somebody else. As you said, Charlie, they have to make appointments to the cabinet. They also, within the first few days, have to write letters of last resort, Imaan, which is where they write letters to the submarine commanders, who are our nuclear defence in this country, and basically instruct them on what to do if the government gets wiped out in a nuclear first strike. Now, this is pretty much the point where I check out. I just sort of think, I'm not sure I could write a letter to someone about what to do in the event of a Holocaust. What do you make of that? That's pretty shocking, isn't it? The first few days in the job.
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to think because they've been elected, they know kind of what to do, but
right.
How does anyone know what to do in that situation?
Exactly, right.
And do they collaborate with other people to figure that out, or is it all on them?
Well, it's all highly classified, so I'm not sure they can even see the previous letters of what other prime ministers had instructed. But the cabinet secretary, who's the senior civil servant, will give advice. But it's ultimately their decision and how to write the letters.
So you're putting the hands of the entire country and
potentially the world.
A couple of people's opinion.
Yeah.
That's really,
scary, isn't it?
Scary.
And it links to what you were saying, Charlie, about you weren't, even though you were you were designated as most likely to be Prime Minister, you weren't up for it. And this, I suppose, is my question. Why are some people up for it? It sounds like a terrible job. Like the enormous responsibility, people haranguing you all the time for what a dreadful job they think you're doing. But some people would, climb over their mothers to get that job. So what's going on, do you think, Charlie? Why would anyone want this?
I suppose part of it is kind of being part of history and creating some sort of a legacy, both for yourself and being part of kind of a country's legacy. I can see why that would be a big draw for someone. I mean, obviously, as someone interested in history myself, that's kind of something that we're always kind of attuned to.
Sure.
But I guess maybe there's, certain personality type. I mean, I'm not a psychology expert in any way, but I guess there's certain personality types that might be make them a bit more willing to kind of leave everything aside and be able to go for that job, which in my mind would be so difficult, especially as someone who likes to, I mean, I guess this is kind of a classic Oxford student thing, but I like to be told I'm doing well, and I feel like regardless of what you're doing as Prime Minister, you'd be criticised regardless, because someone's going to find an issue, whether ideological or practical or whatever, with what you're doing. And I don't think such a complex job, whereas, in other career paths, it's straightforward, where, like, say you're in sales or something, you're making a lot of money, that's good for the company, straightforwardly, that's good. Whereas regardless of what you're doing as a Prime Minister, someone's going to find a problem with
it. So we'll get into the psychology shortly, but I think we ought to, in a classic academic sense, Imaan, sort of figure out what we're even talking about here. Like, how would you even define power? So we've got someone like Robert Greene with his 48 laws of power. There's, lots of people have tried to unravel this concept, but give us your starter for 10. How would you define power, do you think?
It's unfortunately quite a similar definition to emotional intelligence, I would say, which is the the ability to understand and influence, heavy on the influence people. Right. So to have some kind of a position of making decisions for yourself and for others.
So you think that power is more than just physical coercion or intimidation?
Yeah, definitely. Okay. It's more than that, yeah.
Right. Nice. What are your thoughts, Charlie? How would you define power?
I think I'd agree. I think, put simply, it's kind of the capacity to get something done, whether, whether we're talking in these big prime ministerial terms or, we're just talking about, say, someone's responsibilities in an office building or something. Yeah, I definitely agree that it's a lot more than just kind of physical power or brute strength. And, even in a psychological sense, you can kind of exert your power over someone in kind of subtler ways. It might not be just directly telling them to do something or ordering them to do something. It can just be kind of your presence in a room even.
What they would call soft power.
Right. But isn't that sometimes related to what people might perceive as your capacity to physically coerce? In other words, if a 7-foot man with big muscles comes into a room, would they not have more influence because you'll be intimidated by them?
Depends on the context of the room. I mean, if it's like a wrestling competition, probably. But if it's a debating room, probably not.
Right. Well, I suppose that's more broadly my point, is that it is often men who occupy these positions of extraordinary power. So I wonder if what you were describing, Imaan, as influence is sometimes derivative, even as sort of unconsciously, of a sense of physical dominance or the capacity for physical dominance, if you see what I mean. What do you think?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, that is what you think of when you think of power. But I suppose that's the way that John Green puts it in his book, because it's the ability to understand people deeply at a psychological level and therefore in some ways actually manipulate them.
Right, yeah. I mean, that's quite a common way of describing powers. Now, one of my favourite descriptions comes from a political scientist called Stephen Lukes, and he describes 3 faces or 3 dimensions of power. And the first face is the classic, you do something that without your input wouldn't have happened. The second face is a bit more of a negative form of power, that you deny things from the discussion, you take things off the agenda, and so because you've taken it off the table, you've exerted power, but it's not in a positive sense. And then the third dimension is ideological, that you frame the way people see the choices available, and you make them make your preferred decisions without having to actually do anything about it. And this is sort of where we get manipulated, potentially. What do you think about that sort of conceptualization, that sort of definition of power as having three faces, Charlie?
I think it makes a lot of sense. I think, especially if we're thinking in kind of a contemporary political context, you could say that a lot of kind of electioneering and just election campaigning is kind of aiming to influence the conversation in ways that people convince themselves that you're the ideal candidate rather than them telling you. I mean, they're doing that as well. But you also want to get in their heads a bit, which is, I think, why in recent times, we've seen a lot of fear mongering about like, oh, if the other side wins, XYZ things will happen. And yeah, I think when the stakes are that big, I think it's a lot more of that kind of third face of power comes into play. With things that are a bit more lower down on the scale, maybe it's a bit more relaxed, but in those kind of perceived political life or death moments for those individuals, I guess they will go potentially to most extreme ways that are hopefully still legal and allowed to get that kind of power.
Yeah, great. And so, again, we're still sort of grappling with why anyone would want to have power over other people, and that thirst for power, the drive for power. One thing I find really interesting, and Imaan, as a student of literature, I hope you'll appreciate this, is why superheroes are so popular in literature. And my evidence for that claim is that the oldest surviving piece of literature that's been written down, as far as we're aware, is called The Myth of Gilgamesh, and it comes from the Sumerian Empire, which is in modern-day Iraq. And it's about a man who is part god, part human, and he uses supernatural abilities to achieve certain goals, not all of which are good, by the way. But anyway, we have kind of, as a species, gone back and forth to that well of these supernatural entities. So whether it's Achilles or Odysseus, or even, if you like, Jesus Christ has some superhero elements to his story, or Robin Hood, or, all around the world, Zatoichi, the blind samurai from Japan, or Anansi, the magical spider from West Africa, or Harry Potter, or, I don't know, She-Hulk, attorney at law. This is something that we as a species seem drawn to, that sort of story of creatures with these supernatural powers. I suppose my question to you is, why do we find those stories so compelling? Why do we keep going back to that well, do you think?
I think all heroes, in that sense, whether it's literary or figurative, draw admiration. So there's something about them, there's a quality within them that makes people admire them, and that's what makes them influential and powerful. And so being like Prime Minister or being a hero is the ultimate form of ambition and achievement in those contexts.
And so what do you think it is that we admire about them? I mean, I find it so striking that I feel I can connect with people who lived in Sumeria in 3500 BCE. I think that's incredible, that they like the same sort of story archetypes that I like. Seems incredible to me. But I guess I'm still... Why do I admire why do I admire superheroes? What do you think is going on in my brain? You can speculate as you like. some pathology, no doubt.
I think there's just a quality about them. I'm trying to think of an example, but let's say there's a superhero with one particular quality that makes them a hero and not a villain. There's that kind of level of perfection that they have in that aspect that we as humans just can't have. And maybe there's something about that makes us want it.
Right, interesting. And again, do you think there's any significance that many of those hero archetypes are male?
Yeah, never really thought about that. I suppose stereotypically it would make sense, looking at the context of the superheroes, most of them having some kind of strength, right, to associate that with men, but I'm not too sure actually.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's difficult to know whether that's because it's higher demand from men for those sorts of stories, or whether it's just a supply side issue that they've just been supplied by men. What's intriguing is that someone like J.K. Rowling writes about this magical wizard, but she writes about a boy wizard, and he's the main character. Charlie, I mean, so one possible explanation for all of this interest in superheroes is that a lot of us are quite scared a lot of the time. And it's quite nice to fantasize about having a magic wand and wafting away all of those problems. And I think that's possibly where gender may have some relevance, that men perhaps feel a greater insecurity at not having power in various points in their life. But what do you think about that possible theory?
Yeah, I think throughout history, I think that is proven true pretty much time again, especially when kind of gender dynamics are disrupted. So, for instance, at the moment, I'm currently working on my thesis for my history degree, which is focusing on Sir Walter Raleigh and his career in Elizabethan England. And obviously, that time period is quite unique in English history and European history, in the sense that Elizabeth was one of the first queens regnant. So all the men at her court were supposed to, obviously bow and serve a woman, which they weren't, necessarily expecting to do, and they weren't kind of trained to do culturally, and throughout society. Obviously it's a very patriarchal world, and they kind of have to navigate their ability to be masculine and strong and powerful through this kind of female lens. So in the case of Sir Walter Raleigh, he's very much a military man, but his ability to be a military man is very much limited by the amount of soldiers and money that Elizabeth is willing to give him to, kind of fight these wars against the Spanish for her. So one of the sources I'm looking at in my thesis is called The Discovery of Guyana, which is essentially a petition to colonize Guyana in South America on behalf of Elizabeth. And he kind of makes the point that, only I can be the one to kind of physically dominate this space, because, I'm the man with the sword, and you're a woman and you can't take on that role, or at least it's perceived that she can't take on that role. But at the end of the day, at the end of the treaties, he still has to ask her for permission for it. So I think in that specific circumstance, the kind of upsetting of the gender boundaries creates some very interesting manifestations of power. And I think throughout history, you can definitely see when men aren't on top in the way that they expect to be, they find it difficult to navigate that.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, Imaan, what do you make of the idea that people who are power hungry may actually be rather scared, rather sort of anxious, and that they're seeking the power in order to feel more secure? Because that slightly inverts perhaps how we might typically see those who strive for power, who tend to exude a degree of confidence and an air of self-assurance. So do you think there's anything to this theory?
Yeah, I think there is, actually. If you see people in power, for example, the superheroes you mentioned, as being completely infallible and just being, like, even to the extent that they don't die in some examples, that draws upon this real desire within people to remove those fears, the fears that every human tends to have.
Well, I wonder, on that point, I wonder if cheating death is the ultimate thing that we're running away from when we obtain or seek to obtain power. What do you think?
Possibly. I think there's a range of things it could be. But yeah, that might be the ultimate form.
Whether we're willing to articulate it or not, it could be there in the background, right? Maybe.
Eventually. Or just, well, even the desire to influence people, to have a significant role in history and to, like Charlie said, go down in history. That also ties into the idea of being immortal, because to have your name forever remembered for something, again, ties into the idea of I do not ever want to die, whether that's my name or me.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. So if we move from the individual level to the collective level of political power, different countries around the world have different levels of power, and that in itself is interesting. That gets us into the realm of talking about states. And a state was famously defined by a German sociologist called Max Weber as that which has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence within a territory. So if the earth is carved up into different territorial blocks, the group within any of those territories that has the monopoly on violence, that can physically coerce everyone else legitimately, in other words, it's recognised as being allowed, that's the state. It's a relatively sort of negative, you could even say quite cynical definition of political power. What do you make of it on first blush, though, Charlie, that definition of a state?
I think it is cynical for a reason, I suppose, and I suppose, kind of military emergencies. I think maybe we see that emerging a bit more. So, for instance, I don't know, the January 6th insurrection, for instance, that's
in America.
That's an instance where we saw very clearly the potential of the state to act or not act kind of with violence or with physical coercion of people. And I suppose day to day you might not see it that way because, obviously, hopefully there aren't, these massive disasters that require an intervention on that level every day, and things go on peacefully. But I think, like we were saying earlier with kind of the the letters of last resort that the Prime Minister signs, I think having that as kind of a backdoor, that kind of legal coercion, the ability to kind of make these decisions quickly and, in some sense control the population in some way, whether that's, their physical movement or things like that. I think it does, at the end of the day, kind of define the ultimate powers that a state has.
So, as with personal power, Imaan, political power is quite difficult to pin down. I mean, I wonder if we can try and thrash it out with a seemingly simple question, which is, which of these two countries do you think is the more powerful? And don't worry if you're not an expert in these countries, but just in your sort of initial sense. Is it North Korea or South Korea? Both of which have some of those sort of barbarian elements of monopolizing violence within their territory, but obviously South Korea is much richer. North Korea has more military power. So what's going through your head?
What came to mind for me was North Korea because of the military power.
Right.
I'm not sure why I weighed that above everything that South Korea has.
Okay,
though.
Sure.
But
that's interesting.
I think because you see it a lot in the headlines and the news, and there's an element of fear around having a strong military or another country having a strong military. So, yeah, that's what came to mind for me.
Interesting, because it comes back to what you were saying at the start, that power is kind of influence. It's not it's what we might sort of slightly unfairly call soft power. It's not just, brutish strength. But now you seem to be saying actually North Korea's brutish strength is what wins the day.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
So I've done one of those awful things that Oxford tutors do of remembering something you said.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I suppose power is just kind of unavoidable in any context. Even if you think about, for example, the layout of a room and there being a chair at the end of this table,
absolutely,
that's the person who has the most influence because of his ability or her ability to communicate with everyone on that table.
Right.
And so it's just kind of unavoidable in every context.
And Charlie, quite a lot of political geographers and political scientists have tried to figure out why there are patterns of power around the globe seem to be so different. And a prominent question is commonly, why has Africa often been left behind when it comes to being empowered politically? Do you have any sense as to some of the possible answers to that?
Well, I agree that it is strange because, obviously going back, obviously millions of years, civilization began in Africa. So you might think initially that, if it's kind of the center that everyone kind of dispersed from, then it would kind of have a power in that sense. But I suppose that just with the various patterns of kind of the growth of Mediterranean power especially, even though Africa is obviously very close to that, I think there was always kind of a sense of otherness, and there's definitely a racial aspect to that, because, for years there was the belief, and it's even in some of the travel literature I'm looking in my thesis, that, people coming from Africa or coming from any place that's not your home, basically, are in some way strange or corrupt or evil, or, they're not as clever as you. So I think even though Africa has often been kind of on the border of kind of Central European power for so long, it's still been just far enough away, I suppose, that it's easy to kind of write it off and not care about it. And, obviously if we're thinking of kind of European colonization, it was a long time before kind of the whole scope of Africa was fully explored by Europeans.
Sure.
So I suppose in terms of its power, a lot of it was kind of unrealized and undiscovered just because people didn't think to go very far into the continent itself. So there's definitely an element of just the geography of it as well.
Yeah, right.
Of, only, the very northern tip was really considered by a lot of the people in the most substantial positions of power earlier on in history.
Yeah, good. And so if we think about how not only individuals might thirst for power, but how groups of individuals in states and societies might strive for power collectively, what could be the motivation for that shared endeavour of becoming more powerful? So if a state becomes more powerful, it gets more bureaucratic capacity, right? It can make laws, it can raise taxes, it can stand armies and so on. One other famous political sociologist called Charles Tilley said it's all about war. War made the state, and then the state went to war. And in parts of the world where you live in tight, population-dense, packed, sort of friction-full societies, you get more war because people fight over various resources like water, land, natural minerals, and so on. And Europe is a prime example of this. The reason that the Europeans have had or started so many conflicts is not because Europeans are by nature bloodthirsty, but because they are in a context where conflict is more likely. They are living tightly together. There is relative scarcity of resources. And so there's an incentive to get organized together so that you're ready to fight your neighbors for whatever might come next. In Africa, historically, there was much less of an incentive to do that. You could survive with much more sparse, low population density. There wouldn't be so much of that friction until colonists came in and started carving up spaces and said, oh, this belongs to us and that belongs to you. What do you make of that argument, Imaan?
I do agree with that. I think that also applies to the context of other countries, like Hindustan partitioning into India and Pakistan, and all of the conflict that's happening there at the moment.
Right.
Mostly because I would say a lot of it ties to the colonial repercussions. But also I think it's about avoiding weakness. So not necessarily chasing power, but avoiding being in a position where you are the weakest.
The death fear again, is it?
Yeah, I think so.
Maybe. Sorry, I interrupted. Carry on.
No, yeah, that was
okay.
I
do apologise. But so another really fascinating book by a man called Jared Diamond, called Guns, Germs, and Steel, poses the question: why didn't Africa invade Europe with rhino-mounted cavalry? And this is another interesting element to the story. That we have these sort of pretty cool horses, but they have rhinos. I mean, come on. Why didn't they dominate Europe? And one of his arguments, which is really intriguing, is that there aren't any animals you can easily domesticate in Africa. So you can tame the odd animal and keep it as an individual. But what you can't do is generation after generation domesticate animals that you can then utilize for military or agricultural purposes. Europe and Asia, they hit the bonanza. They had horses, they had pigs, they had cattle, they had chickens, they had all of sheep, all of these things that we've used to make ourselves rich, healthy, and to grow big surplus populations, and then ultimately to fight battles with. In Africa, they were very unlucky. I mean, zebras are an interesting case study. Zebras may look like horses, but they can't be domesticated. You can tame individual zebras, but if you try and domesticate a zebra, all that will happen is that one zebra will come with you and the rest will leave. Horses, because they will come together as a group. If you take the alpha horse, then you'll get the rest of the horses and you can domesticate the whole bunch of them. So just through misfortune, if you like, Africa didn't have those animals. And the same in the Americas as well. Why didn't the European colonists come to an America that was highly economically developed with big states and taxation and all the rest of it? Because, again, there was no particular need to live in densely populated societies, and they didn't have many animals that they could extract value from. So what do you think about that explanation, Charlie, for differences in power around the world?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I think, societies have to work with kind of the resources they're given. And even in just kind of a European context on its own, I remember, I think this was in first year, we studied kind of an influential notion of empire building, the parenthesis, which was about the Empire of Charlemagne, who was a big empire builder in the 9th century in Europe. And the kind of crucial argument was the reason that Charlemagne because he was the founder of the Holy Roman Empire, and the kind of reason that he decided to essentially conquer Europe rather than conquer another part of the world was because of the rise of Islam in the Middle East, under Mohammed meant that Europe was, for once, thrown back on its own resources, and they had to kind of squabble amongst each other for the resources around the Mediterranean rather than going off eastward to essentially colonize those territories. So I think societies are very much a kind of victim of circumstance, in the sense that you kind of make do with what you're given. And, obviously we see that now, excluding, obviously people like Putin, you don't see many invasions going on these days, because I think, the status quo is just recognized of, we live in this place, we've got this amount of resources, obviously, taking into account, obviously globalization, there's tons of kind of trade going on all the time, so there's less incentive to do it. But also you just kind of live the way I guess you've always been living, and it's, I guess, sometimes easier to accept that and adapt to it rather than taking on a new challenge of trying to conquer an entire continent.
Right, yeah. So just to round off, Imaan, it's commonly said that knowledge is power. So is thirsting for knowledge tantamount to thirsting for power?
Yes, to some extent. Yeah.
So why do we do that? I mean, why would anyone do that?
Because I think knowledge helps you with building an internal understanding of the world, as opposed to like physical power or external power, which is meant to dominate others. And so having a thirst for knowledge is done, well, it can be done in a negative way as well, if you're planning to apply that knowledge in a bad way. But I think it's still a really powerful way of obtaining power, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing.
So curious listeners who are going to listen to our other podcast should not fear that their thirst for knowledge is somehow a bad thing. That is a very reassuring point on which to end. Thank you both ever so much, and thank you to the listeners for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next time on another What, Why, When podcast from Oxford University. Thanks everyone, goodbye.